who are not killed inherit the family money. The survivors inherit the family wealth. And this means that even though there are fewer people in Florence, the ones that are left are richer than they were before. But of course, that's not going to really make much difference unless they're willing to spend the money. But in this case, they did tend to be willing to spend the money, especially on art and culture, because they wanted to make and buy things that would make them feel better, bring them comfort. They didn't know how long they would be around, so they didn't really want to make industrial, commercial, long-term investments. They wanted to buy things that would give them a better standard of living, a kind of luxurious living. And so they tended to buy books and art and commission chapels and things like that with the money that they inherited from the family becoming smaller along the way. So for all these reasons, the economic depression actually did, in fact, help kick off the Renaissance in Florence. Next, what we'll do is take a brief look at the way the woolen cloth industry was actually structured and how it worked. And then we'll move on to take a look a little bit at how this affected other areas of Florentine life. The structure of the woolen cloth industry in Florence really determines the structure of most other things there. It determines the structure of the political system, of social life, a lot of other aspects of life are determined by this. And as we've seen before when we talked about the Ciompi, for example, the woolen cloth industry, like every other industry, every place in Europe in the early modern period, is controlled by guilds. Now, guilds, as everyone knows, are organizations of master businessmen who organize themselves into a group which essentially controls trade in the branch of commerce or trade that they happen to be involved in. So, for example, blacksmiths have their guild, the woolen merchants have their guild. Every craftsman, artisan, merchant, whatever their area of industry, they all belong to a guild, because you can't carry on commercial activity in any area without belonging to a guild. In the woolen cloth guild, in the woolen cloth industry, there were two basic kinds of guilds. On the top, in charge of the woolen cloth industry, there were the 7 great guilds. And these were guilds of merchants who did the buying and selling of the product. They're really at the top of the whole structure. And these are also the people who tend to monopolize political power in Florence. Also in the woolen cloth industry, there are 14 lesser guilds, guilds of people lower down, for example, the Ciompi, but we'll see many others in a couple of minutes. These are guilds of artisans or craftsmen who actually provide the industrial activity which produces the product. So you might call them industrial guilds in a kind of early modern way, whereas the 7 great guilds were commercial guilds. But like I said before, political power in Florence pretty much rests with the 7 great guilds. And you'll see why this was in the end of this lecture, beginning of next lecture. Of course, the Medici were members of the great guilds. What I'm going to do is describe just a few of these guilds to give you some idea of what they were and how they worked, but we won't go through all of them. Of the 7 great guilds, the 3 most important were these. On top of the social structure, number 1 pretty much is the Cambio. That's the guild of bankers, and that's the guild the Medici belonged to. That tends to be the guild of people who have the most money. The bankers are always kind of at the top of the social structure. Second down, in second place, is a guild called the Calimala Guild. This was a guild of wool merchants. And what they did was they bought the raw wool from various places. They would often go as far as we've seen, as far as to England, which was a major supplier of raw wool. They'll buy the raw wool, they'll bring it to Florence. They then distribute it to domestic spinners and weavers. And this is very often a commercial exchange here. They'll bring the raw wool in and actually sell it to these domestic spinners and weavers who spin it and weave it into cloth in their homes. And that's basically what the wool merchants do. These wool merchants only handle the raw wool. They don't handle the woolen cloth, the finished product, so to speak. The third guild down, called the Lana, was a guild of woolen cloth merchants. They're the ones who would go around to the domestic spinners and weavers and purchase the finished cloth, usually in very large bolts, usually unfinished, undyed. They would then usually, pay them. It was again a commercial exchange. They would take the woolen cloth and distribute it to other lesser guilds where it would be finished, dyed, and made into pretty much the final commercial product. There were also other great guilds, but I think those are examples that pretty much make it clear what they're doing. Further on down, the lesser guilds have a very different kind of picture. And I'll just mention a few of these and tell you what they did, and you'll see that in many cases their activities are pretty limited, as were their incomes. There was the Guild of Fullers, for example. What they did was take the woolen cloth and beat it with boards to fill in any kind of holes that might be in the cloth. And that was their entire job. Take this woolen cloth and beat it with a board. There was the Guild of Softeners. They would take the finished cloth and apply to it a substance called alum, which they would kind of rub into it, which would make it somewhat softer. Now, if you know anything about woolen cloth, you'll know it's not very soft. It has all sorts of problems, like it's difficult to wash it and so forth. But without alum, it might be unbearable, so these people were important. The Guild of Washers, another lesser guild, would take the woolen cloth down to the River Arno, the main river running through the middle of Florence, and wash it. After they washed it, they would stretch it out to make it a little bit longer. The Guild of Dyers would apply dyes and make the wool different colors. You can't apply too many dyes to woolen cloth. There are no chemical dyes in this period, so it's all vegetable-based dyes, like yellow dye from onions, blue dye coming from indigo, which is expensive, so you don't see a whole lot of that, red dye taken from clay, and things like that, to make the cloth a little bit more attractive. It's still in these long bolts, though. It's a little softer. It's now got some nice colors. The next guild, another guild of lesser guilds, is the Guild of Shearers, and they cut the cloth into various different lengths, so that it's sold not as a huge bolt in many cases, but in different lengths. And then the cloth is given to people called menders, who sew up any damage done through all these other processes, and there's going to be damage on almost every step. And another guild called the Guild of Pressers will take a big iron and iron it out to make it flat and get the wrinkles out, and that's pretty much what they do. And as we all know, at the very bottom of the social scale were the Ciampi, whose entire job was to comb out the tangles in the original raw wool. So all sorts of different guilds, different tasks. Each guild only does its own task. So, and it's also, it's illegal for anybody who's not in the guild to do that task. It's illegal for anybody in another guild to do a task of another guild. There's no crossing over. It's a very compartmentalized thing. Wage levels are strictly regulated. And of course, the people on the bottom are not making very much, where the people at the top who buy and sell the product in the raw wool are doing pretty well. As you probably know, the typical guild, and this is especially characteristic of the artisanal guilds, has 3 different people in it. This is kind of important for the structure of the industry in general. The guy who actually belongs to the guild is the master craftsman, the master dyer or presser or mender or whatever else. And he will be the guy who owns the shop and also owns whatever tools might be being used, basically owns all the hardware being used at that step in the process. In every case, he will have his shop on the bottom floor of his house. His family will live on the top floors, and it'll be all, in one building. He'll do his work on the bottom floor. In many cases, he has a big kind of window thing he can open on the first floor, and forming a kind of table, and he put his wares out there and let people see what he's doing, so it's all very public activity. The other major person in a guild is the apprentice, who is learning the trade. His family has apprenticed him to this master. He doesn't really get paid a wage. He lives in the master's house. He eats at the master's table at the master's expense. He often does other things for the master. And he learns the trade as much as he can by watching the master, although in actual fact, the way guilds worked is that masters very often just sat back and told the apprentices what to do, and the apprentices did almost all the work. In some cases even, the master would contract out the work to wage workers and get other people involved. But in most cases, the master is more like the supervisor instead of a guy actually doing the work, although he does supervise. Then finally, you'll have a journeyman or journeymen who are just wage workers. They're not learning the trade. They're not going to ever move up. They're not going to go anywhere. They just sweep the floor and empty the garbage and do the manual labor and get paid a really poor wage. And they're called journeymen because they tend to leave one job and go to another and travel around quite a bit. And it's an important aspect of the industry, but those people are really in dead-end jobs. Even the apprentice, though, there's no guarantee he will ever move up and actually become a master and join the guild, because there's got to be a spot for him. And there aren't always open spots in a guild. As a matter of fact, more often than not, they're not open spots. And so, a lot of journeymen, a lot of apprentices lived in hopes that the master would die and leave the shop to the apprentice. Maybe he would marry the master's daughter and move into the family and kind of inherit the business, and he'd move up and become a guild member that way. But even becoming a member of the guild, even if, for example, the master died and basically said to the apprentice, you can have the shop and everything, the apprentice would have to show to the guild that he could do the quality of work that the guild required. He would have to gain admission to the guild in his own right. And he would do this by producing an example of whatever work he does, for example, pressing cloth or washing it. And his example would be called a masterpiece. He would take it to the guild warden, the guy in charge, and if the guild warden liked it, he'd be admitted to the guild after he pays a huge fee. Can't pay the fee, you don't get admitted even if you do good work. But if you do produce good material and you can pay the fee, you get into the guild, now you're really lucky. But now you face the fact that your industrial activity is heavily regulated. The quality of stuff you make is determined by the guild. They inspect it. You got to make up to a certain quality, but you can't make better than that. The price you sell it for is regulated. They expect that too. And the whole impetus behind this is, in some ways, restraint of trade, or at least restraint of competition. Guilds are designed to make sure everybody in the guild makes a similar living. Nobody undercuts the others and makes more money. Nobody's going to lose out because he can't charge as much. It's going to all be an even playing surface for everybody. Now, that's not competition. And as far as I know, that's not capitalism. It's a guild-based economy, often called a domestic economy. And this was the economy in Florence and in the rest of Europe up until the 18th century. So when you read in various books that capitalism was born and flourishing in Renaissance Italy, well, maybe. But since everybody's in a guild and everybody in the guild's regulated, it doesn't seem like, modern day capitalism to me at least. Okay, so that's kind of how the guild structure was organized. The guild structure directly influenced the political structure of Florence. It's almost as if one were an imprint of the other. Florence was officially a republic, a commune, as you know, but in fact it was ruled in large part by a group of wealthy men who belonged to the 7 great guilds. We'll talk a lot more about this in the next lecture. In our modern point of view, it's a small group of wealthy people, an oligarchy. In Europe at this time, it really was a fairly broadly representative government, which could correctly be called a commune. And so Florence, in the Renaissance, is politically based in this communal structure.